All right, well, it's a privilege to turn from all things legal, political, cultural this morning in the abortion wars to a conversation about racial justice and interfaith cooperation and leadership and religious pluralism and some of the practical matters of race in the country today. Get to introduce two wonderful scholars, one leading and founding an organization. Ibu founded Interfaith America in 2002 and continues on today as its president, a fascinating organization in Chicago. And another voice who is an academic at Baylor. So let me introduce first Ibu, since he'll speak first, and Jonathan will speak second, and then we'll turn it open over to you, just like this morning. Ibu Patel is obviously a civic leader who's all about religious pluralism and interfaith cooperation in American democracy, American democratic life. He has this line in a new video that they just did about how we've moved from being a country that was rightly described by many people as Judeo-Christian to a country that's interfaith, and that it has to mean something that that's the case. And his organization is trying hard to wrestle with that and work with campuses and with many leaders all around the country. He was on Obama's inaugural Faith Council. He's given a gazillion keynote addresses across the country. He's written 5 books, the most recent of which we will actually have for you as you exit today. Nicole is setting out copies of the book, We Need to Build, or rather, is it A Time to Build?
No, that's Yuval Levin's book, which is a great book. But
We Need to Build. So that's going to be here for you as we finish. He's an Ashoka Fellow. He has a doctorate in sociology of religion from Oxford. He was a Rhodes Scholar with Sewell. How's that? Back in the day, together, same class.
Sewell is a point of information.
We were there at the same time. I was nearly a month.
I'm prone to inflation. Sorry. Maybe that's higher up.
I was with Amy's husband, who was a Rhodes Scholar.
Oh, really? Just along with Amy Sullivan's husband at the same time? Sheesh, man. There's just deep waters in this ecosystem. He and his wife, Shanaz, have 2 sons, live in Chicago. Really looking forward to your being with us. Thank you for coming. Dr. Jonathan Tran is the Baines Scholar, Baines Chair of Religion at Baylor University, same school as Philip Jenkins. He's done 4 books. They cover theologies of memory and wartime, Foucault, the idea of corners in the show The Wire, the Showtime the series, and also the City of God. And this most recent book, which I would encourage as well. And by the way, Nicole just said, if anybody wants a copy of this book, she's happy to order you a copy. If you really like what you hear, get a copy from Nicole. But it's Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, which includes a window into his own story as an immigrant from Vietnam, the Big Wave, and life in exilic minority status on the West Coast. He's a visiting professor this coming fall at University of Chicago, and he lives in Waco with his spouse, 2 kids, 4 cats and chickens, and his wife, who's here with us today, you'll see her tonight at dinner, turns 50 today. So give her a few props for that when you see her tonight, okay? But the plan is for Ibu first to talk, and then for Jonathan to respond, then over to you. Ibu, welcome to Faith Angle.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Jonathan, whose book I've really enjoyed reading, and I just found one of those books where the ethnography is excellent, but also it says what's been on my mind theoretically that I just haven't been smart enough to say directly. So thank you for that. So I want to do, here's the kind of thesis of my talk and the proposition I want to offer, which is, what if our conversations about diversity took as their starting point how different religious groups cooperate in the civic sphere? That was the paradigm, right? How do different religious groups cooperate in the civic sphere? Social services, disaster relief, refugee resettlement, etc. That was the archetype. And I would put this just as kind of a thought experiment up against the current dominant operating paradigm, which is the power, privilege, and oppression paradigm. Within the world of race, it's anti-racism, but it is the same paradigm basically across 3 identity categories: race, gender, and sexuality. It could easily be operative around class. We talked more about class in America, but what? It could probably easily be operative around race if we talk more about race in America. But in the spheres of culture in which I spend most of my time, which is higher education and journalistic and media worlds, it's race, gender, and sexuality. The paradigm is power, privilege, and oppression. The key question of this paradigm is, how have you oppressed me? You walk into a room and ask the question, how have you oppressed me? And what I want to wonder is if we begin with a different starting point. Again, just like the operating paradigm is totally different, which is, how do we cooperate across difference? This is actually like not rocket science, it's not genius. In some ways, it's an older American diversity paradigm. How do we cooperate across difference? And to make it a little bit more sophisticated, I would put it this way. In a diverse democracy, the only way to have a functioning society is if people who disagree on some fundamental things are able to work together on other fundamental things. There's an elementary school way of putting this, which is how do we cooperate across difference? There's a bumper sticker way of putting this, which we call respect, relate, cooperate. The political philosophy way of putting this is, in a diverse democracy, where diversity is not just the differences you like. It is people who believe very different things on very fundamental issues, okay, just like this morning. How do you have a functioning society unless people are able to disagree on some fundamental things and work together on others? And the two big things I want to do in my 22 minutes left is to say, actually, the current power, privilege, and oppression paradigm is not only inadequate to many of our identity and diversity challenges in the United States, it is distortive to it. It has gone from being an interesting critique to a distortive, controlling paradigm. As a critique, it is interesting. As a paradigm, it is distortive. I want to offer a couple of just, illustrations to that point, and then I want to move to, I think, the strength of thinking about this differently to that cooperative paradigm. So and by the way, I'm taking, part of my confidence here is Jonathan's book, right, in which he says, there's a great quote in it, in which he says identitarian anti-racism is the operative paradigm. It is the orthodoxy, and that is what you are, it is so pervasive as to be invisible. It's almost like gravity in many precincts of higher ed and its kind of adjacent worlds, right? Or elite media and its adjacent worlds. And it is a worldview that is constantly seeking to shrink the world into it. I'm going to say that again. It is a worldview that is constantly willing and seeking to distort the actual facts of the world to fit into that worldview. And Jonathan's book is just an excellent kind of multiple case studies of how that happens with very well put theoretical implications. I'm going to give you three kind of slightly more modest ones. So I have two boys, 12 and 15, and past couple of years, they've come home on more than a few occasions and basically said some version of, my English teacher asked like how I feel oppressed as a Muslim. Or my summer camp counselor asked how I feel oppressed as a Muslim. Shadi is like giving a look, right? So a couple of things on this, right? Number one, my kids have grown up like being called terrorists on playgrounds, blah, blah, blah. There's ugly Islamophobia out there. We live in Whole Foods America. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens often enough that I'm very, very happy that the authorities, the teachers, et cetera, they have a radar screen for this. Was not the case when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s. I am very grateful for that, right? But that is not what is going on here. What is going on here, and I'm going to put this very starkly, is that Islam is made significant by the presence of Islamophobia, and that pisses me off. Being Muslim doesn't matter unless there's bigotry against it. Islam is not important unless there's Islamophobia. Here's the issue. Islam actually has content as a tradition. And the interesting fact of the content of Islam is that it, by cosmic and God-ordained axiom, you are not meant to feel oppressed. The Quran over and over and over again and constantly recounts the favors of your Lord. And God has given you his grace. And here are the responsibilities attendant to this. Now, by the way, this doesn't mean that there's no category for oppression in Islam, right? That absolutely exists. But as far as like your general human psychology, this is not like some like minority reading of the tradition, right? As far as your general human psychology, here are the important facts of the world. God exists, created you, gave you his various prophets and books, expects you to be thankful for it, and expects you to behave according to the teachings you offer, most important of which is to be merciful to other human beings. Like, that's the tradition in 4 lines. And so for my kids to be like asked by well-meaning people, like, how do you feel oppressed? My reading of that is you are violating the tradition. By the way, I don't think it's just Muslims who feel that, right? I think religious traditions like have uniquely kind of codified content, like single books, et cetera, but I don't think it's just Muslims who feel kind of like, wait a second, you are disorienting the content of where I come from by wanting me to feel oppressed. This is another part of Jonathan's book. Like, why is an anti-racist analysis more theoretically sexy? Why do we want there to be so much racism in the world? Point number 2. So I was a senior fellow this past year at the Othering and Belonging Institute, which is John Powell's great institute located at Berkeley, one of the largest higher ed-based diversity centers in the country. Probably 40, like staff and affiliates, researchers, organizers, et cetera, et cetera. And John was concerned. John Powell is a well-known name, just a remarkable human being. John was concerned that religion was not only not present, but was like actively dismissed in derogatory ways. So I'm a senior fellow, it's all virtual, so I don't get a chance to be a part of the culture of this place over the past year. But as part of my work, I present a paper at the end, religion and peace building, right? Like basically the resources that diverse religious traditions have for peace building. And nothing in here is rocket science. It's stuff like, St. Francis going to meet the Sultan during the Crusades. It's the Buddhist prayer for peace. It's basically like, here's all of the ways that religious traditions, all of the resources they have within prayer, within history, within scripture, for peace building. And the respondent to this, in her 15-minute response, did not spend 1 second dealing with the content of the paper. Spoke for 15 minutes about how hard it was for her to even say yes to anything regarding religion because of its patriarchal, homophobic, oppressive structures. 15 minutes, okay? So fine, that's one tenured Berkeley professor, plate to type, whatever. The next hour of discussion with the 40 researchers and affiliates at the Othering and Belonging Institute, let me say again, amongst the largest diversity centers in higher ed based in the country, right? It entirely follows suit. And it was so dominant that I didn't even ask, did anybody read the paper? I mean, this is a university after all. You have PhDs after all. Did anybody read the paper, or are we only going to talk about a construction of religion that is so distorted as to be totally unrecognizable to virtually every religious person I know? That's the far end of a standard continuum, right? So like I would say that is what happened was a caricature, but it was totally recognizable to me. And I would say I've been on 150 campuses, and I would say there's some version of that on 140, right? Which is the first question about religious identity and diversity is, can you please justify the patriarchal, homophobic, oppressive structure of your religion? Not how does this give meaning to so many people, not like, wow, it's really remarkable that Catholics build these universities and all these other people like go to them and graduate from them, but patriarchal, oppressive, homophobic structures. That's it. That's all you need to know. Point number 3, and again, part of what I'm doing is and part of what I'm suggesting is that, part of what I'm pointing out is that if you have a power, privilege, and oppression paradigm, and you impose it on religion, right? That paradigm comes out of certain, I think, like understandable ways of thinking around race, gender, and sexuality. But you take that paradigm to religion, this is what you get. The third thing you get is, so I'll reference Russell. So Russell uses the word social justice this morning in reference to, anybody remember? Pro-life Christians, right? Well, we think this is a matter of social justice. So what's interesting about that is, just for a moment, right? If you run mostly in kind of the blue worlds of America, I want you to wonder for a second how many times you have heard the word social justice as if the viewpoint of pro-life evangelical Christians. I would say, again, I spent a ton of time on college campuses. I've probably been to 150 over the past 10 years. I would say that the word social justice is used 100 times in any conversation I'm in, and nobody ever suggests that people from different identity groups have different definitions of justice, which is actually just obvious. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that Reformed Jews and conservative Catholics have a different definition of justice around abortion. But if the power, privilege, and oppression paradigm is the operating paradigm, right, then you're not asking the question, how do people who have different first principles, how do people with different ideas of creation and salvation, how is it that they understand the world? And given that they understand it very differently, is it not remarkable that they're cooperating in all of these other ways? Then you never use the word social justice as if it represents a single point of view or a single identity group. You are constantly saying different definitions of social justice are constantly contested, and actually it is a darn miracle we continue to function as a society nonetheless. So I want to move on to that miracle for a second, right? I want to highlight a couple things that we just take for granted in America, right? Inner City Muslim Action Network, southwest side of Chicago, starts as this kind of grassroots Muslim social services effort, grows into a 100-person, pretty sophisticated community development and social justice coming out of the Muslim tradition organization. So it erects the first permanent memorial to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. in Chicago. Muslim organization builds a permanent memorial to a Christian minister. By the way, part of that memorial is a statue to Rabbi Robert Marks, right next to the King statue, right? Muslim organization does this. When Inner City Muslim Action Network was getting its start, Pentecostal church down the street was like, hey, look, in addition to social services, y'all got to do some community organizing. Rami's like, I got no idea how to do that. And they're like, we'll teach you. So you got all these like Palestinian Muslims in this black Pentecostal church learning community organizing. Jewish organization, the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs was like, hey, look, you're now 5-6 years in, you people need a strategic plan. They help Iman do a strategic plan. We just take this for granted. We just totally take for granted that an organization founded by Muslims would be getting community organizing training from a black Pentecostal church and get strategic plan help from a Jewish organization. And by the way, when the tragedy of a father of 4 pizza delivery guy gets murdered in a crossfire situation, we're talking 63rd in California, it happens way more often than it should. They collaborate with the synagogue down the street. Yes, southwest side of Chicago has a synagogue. It's the synagogue that actually King and his marchers went to when the hail of bricks and stones came on Kedzie in the southwest side of Chicago, and the Catholic Church to do a Muslim-Jewish Catholic memorial of this man. A Juma prayer, a Shabbat service, and then a Catholic Mass. Right? Again, we just think that that's normal. That's just America. Example number 2, HIAS, founded as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Service. 1882, resettles Jews during the Russian pogroms of the late 19th century, resettles Jews during all of the crazy pogroms of the early and mid 20th century. In 1975, they are asked by President Ford to resettle people from Vietnam. And so this Jewish organization starts to resettle many Buddhists from Vietnam and other parts of Southeast Asia. And then they decide that actually a very Jewish thing to do is to help non-Jews. And now, as you can imagine, there are many fewer Jewish refugees in the world, right? Has the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society folded and said, our mission is done? No. They set up operations in Kenya. They spend most of their time resettling Muslims. We just think this is normal. An organization founded by Jews to resettle Jewish refugees would spend most of its time resettling Muslims. Georgetown University, first Jesuit Catholic university in the United States, founded in the late 18th century. Bishop John Carroll, friend of George Washington's. So as the Jewish population of this Jesuit Catholic university grows in the middle of the 20th century, they hire a rabbi on Georgetown's dime. 1968. And as the Muslim population starts to grow in the 1990s, they hire an imam. And as the Buddhist and Hindu populations start to grow in the early 21st century, they hire Buddhist and Hindu ministers and priests. Just normal in America, right? Part of what I want to offer is it's actually quite remarkable. And what if we look through the world as what does it mean for people with fundamentally different worldviews to be cooperating in a range of activities that they can agree on and to disagree in proximity without killing each other? So I promise you, the Reformed Jewish rabbi on the staff of Georgetown University does not hold the same view on a whole set of fundamental issues that the Jesuits do. And yet there she is, employed by Georgetown. So here's a reference point about how remarkable this is. So 8 or 10 years ago, there's a front page New York Times piece, maybe some of you saw it, which basically opens with the line, when there is a fire on the Catholic side of the city of Mostar in the nation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Muslim fire department does not respond. Anybody remember this story? Okay, second paragraph. When there's a fire on the Muslim side of Mostar, the Catholic fire department does not respond. And the article is an ethnographic description of the total separation in civic life along ethno-religious lines, Bosnian Muslim, Croat Catholic in the city of Mostar, which is a city that is not in hot conflict. This is not a shooting civil war. This is just normal life, right? Different nightclubs for different religious groups, same school buildings, but Catholics go to school from 7:30 a.m. to 1, and Muslims go to school from 2 to 8. Different garbage collection companies. So part of what I want to put out there is that's actually most of the human condition through most of human history. What do identity groups do? We build institutions that propagate our identity. That is what we do, right? Why did the Puritans found Harvard in the middle of the 17th century? Because we need educated ministers for the churches of our future. That's what identity communities do. So how remarkable is it that in the United States, one of the things that religious identity groups do is they build institutions as an expression of their identity that serve people from all identities. That is part of what they do, right? So there's many things to be said about the Southern Baptist Convention that are bad and true. Here is one thing that is good and true. The Southern Baptists trained about as many disaster relief volunteers as the Red Cross. And if there's a hurricane or a tornado or an earthquake in your town, they will show up at your door, along with the Catholics and the Mormons, all of whom with very, very different doctrines and theologies, people who deeply disagree with each other, and they will figure out a safe place for you to sleep and a warm meal for you to eat. And what I don't understand for the life of me is why we don't consider this the single most important dimension of diversity in America. The way that different religious identity groups build institutions that cooperate across lines of fundamental difference for other forms of civic welfare. And just to get a sense of how widespread this is, Bridgespan Group did a report recently in which they did their kind of quant thing on the percentage of social services that were provided by or funded by religious groups in different cities. 6 different cities: Amarillo, San Francisco, Detroit, Montgomery, DC. So the lowest percentage was 35%. The highest was 75%. So just to make this a little bit more fun, to give some texture to it, do the mental exercise. Imagine for a moment all of the institutions founded by religious communities in your city disappeared overnight. Think first of the churches, synagogues, and mosques, right? And depending on your thinking, your orientation towards religion, maybe it's a tragedy for you if people don't have a place to worship on Friday afternoons or Sunday mornings, whatever, right? Think about, where's the AA group going to meet if that place closes? The Lutheran preschool, where do you think its non-tuition funding comes from? Except for the Lutheran Church. And then for a moment, right, in Chicago, who started Northwestern? Both university and hospital. Methodists. Who started Loyola? Both university and hospital. Jesuits. Who started Rush? Presbyterians. And on and on and on. Think about the preschools. Think about the social service agencies. Think about the disaster relief operations. Part of what I am pointing out is not only do what we have in the United States as far as cooperating across religious difference for what I call civic welfare, not only is it relatively rare in human history, it is so widespread in America. It is so widespread. It is such a part of our civic fabric that if it went away, the nation, it would be unimaginable. I mean, just think of the YMCA. It's the largest association outside of out of AAA in the United States. Who built that place? Right? Who built it? And who does it serve now? So I want to end with one other thing. I think that part of what I find remarkable about the dominance of the power, privilege, and oppression paradigm, right? And I don't know if it's, if I would find if the dominance is best understood as cannibalization or colonization. I don't know if it eats from within or if it superimposes from without. But how it prevents us from seeing objectively important things. Objectively important things. So let me give you one of those, and I will end with this. America starts as a racist project. We all know that. It also starts as an anti-Catholic project. What was John Winthrop escaping when he sails from England on the Arabella? In his own language, the whore of Babylon, the designs of Jesuits. He's escaping the influence of the Catholic Church. That is the reason he comes to the Eastern Seaboard and builds his city on a hill. Right? His city on a hill does not have Catholic bells in it. So here's what I find interesting about that. Somewhere around 2009, 2010, we had a black president, 6 Supreme Court justices who were Catholic, and an entire presidential line of succession that was Catholic. John Kerry, Joe Biden, John Boehner. Not only was nobody freaking out, right? Like this is the nightmare of basically every 19th century American minus Frederick Douglass, right? Black president and an entire Catholic political order. Nobody was really celebrating either. Nobody was saying, is it not remarkable that America has metabolized its anti-Catholicism? How is that not an objectively important fact? Anybody remember any noteworthy anti-Catholicism around the Joe Biden campaign for office outside of certain conservative bishops? The second Catholic to be elected to the American presidency. Virtually no controversy, right? Put that in conversation with Al Smith and John Kennedy. How is it not an objectively important fact that this also is a sign of America metabolizing maybe its second deepest hatred? But if all you think is power, privilege, and oppression, and if you construct Catholics as powerful and white, you just don't see it. That is a problem. Jonathan.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I want to say a little bit about the book, and then I want to begin by saying personally how I came to the book. But it's a real pleasure to be with Ibu in this. Over the last few weeks, I've read a bunch of his stuff and listened to your voice on podcasts, ad infinitum and this kind of thing. And I feel pretty chastened by your hopefulness. And in reading your work, I try to trace out what the Islam is doing. And I think part of what Islam shares a lot with Christianity, which is the religion I've adopted, is that both of them, among other things, are types of extended training on how to live, say, on the razor's edge between despair and hope. And I take your most recent book to be a kind of full frontal challenge to those who would push all the reasons for despair in ways that would crush hope. And I find that really challenging. As a non-white American, as a religious person, I'm a person who is not only prone to despair, but I'm an academic, so I'm trained to wallow in it. So I find your work and your political life, quite frankly, really invigorating, challenging, chastening. I was thinking how different this conversation and the kinds of considerations and challenges Ibu and I both feel about race and anti-racism, how different of a place on the political spectrum that takes place or occurs than the conversation this morning, say about some of the most worrying things we collectively find about the conservative right, or specifically the Christian right. If there the question is questions about the legitimacy of the Christian church in the context of things around Roe v. Wade and how that legitimacy will go forward. This conversation I find operating, say, on the left, and things that at least I find quite worrying about the left, while being myself certainly a left of center person. But I was thinking in some ways they share common cause in that these are both taking place at the center of what's often referred to as culture war realities. One in relationship to religion, and the other in relationship to academia. And the kinds of politics, close quarter politics that takes place in both domains. So, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a little bit. So I grew up in America. I came to America in 1975 at the end of the Vietnam War. My family was from the north of Vietnam, which in our case meant we were wealthy and landed and aristocratic, educated. When the communists took over, our family was dispossessed of all of its wealth and privilege, and we fled like many thousands of Vietnamese to the south. We were really poor, and when the war ended, we, like tens of thousands of other folks, went to America. We didn't go to America like, say, some of my friends from Taiwan, whose parents came to America because they had aspirations as electrical engineers and came to study, do PhDs at Cornell. My family came on pain of death. We were war refugees. We were extraordinarily poor. We knew a little bit of language. We knew some people. A Lutheran church had adopted our family. As Ibu talked about, a number of religious communities took part in kind of patriating Vietnamese folks to America, but these were really challenging years. This is a difficult memory, but I'll share it because I often think it epitomizes my life in America. My first memory in life was about 2 years in America. I was 5, and my brother David, who's just a year older than I, he's 6, we're crossing the street, and he was killed in front of me when he was hit by a car. And that really began my American journey. The next years were living through that and living through poverty. Racism was constant. It was, as I described at the beginning of the book, 1970s America, racism wasn't just, and I mean the open kinds of racism. You're walking down the street and someone yells out the car, chink. Or the kids in the school refer to you as a Jap or a Gook constantly. Racism at that time, or that kind of racism, wasn't just accepted, it was expected. It's what you expected to encounter when you went out. I mean, remember 1975, 1980, 1980s, America had fought 3 subsequent wars with Asian countries. And we, as a nation, were taught to see people like me as perilous, as dangerous. Asians had killed tens of thousands of Americans. And this was seared on the American conscience. And so the racism for me, and it was from everywhere. It wasn't simply from white folks, though it was certainly a lot from white folks, but it was from Hispanic communities, black folks, and other Asians. Those of you who know much about Asian culture, of course, Asia names an absurdly large set of categories and realities, and there's a pecking order within Asian cultures, and say Vietnamese are just not at the top of that. And so the racism, the kind of blatant racism was constant. And it certainly colored and determined the course of my life. It became the kind of thing that even if I didn't want to think about it as an intellectual or as an academic, it was thrust on me all the time. So that's the racism part of the story, and I don't think it's a particularly unique story for a lot of Asian folks who grew up, say, in the 1970s and 1980s. I think that's changed a bit, but it was certainly my experience. So you had the marginalization, or at least I had the marginalization of American racism as an Asian American kid, as a Vietnamese kid. And then the second marginalization I experienced was in academia, in an academic anti-racism. So if I was first marginalized by racists, then I was next marginalized by anti-racists. The anti-racism conversation in this country I can describe as kind of operating, say, through a sequence of 3 acts. First, people who are not white experience racism. And then people who are not white or black experience a second type of marginalization. Because when most of us think about racism, we invariably think black and white. And there's something morally absolutely necessary and true about that. This country, the soil of this country is seeped deeply with the blood of what white folks have done to black folks and continue to do. But the nature of that story, its density, its moral weight and freight, make it very difficult to begin to scratch the surface on the experience of, say, non-black folks in America. One of the most painful and difficult things I've experienced is to try to give voice to other types of racial suffering without that voicing being seen as competitive or deflating or somehow discounting or diminishing of the powerful and persistent forms of anti-blackness. I'll admit that I haven't succeeded in doing that, that has been as difficult a road, I would say in some ways, as the racism itself. So you have the first step, right? The first act is the racism you experience. The second one is that within what some academics refer to as a white-black binary. Sometimes people refer to it as a black-white binary. I refer to it as white-black because I don't want to give any sense that black folks were party in creating the binary. The binary is a racial logic created by which whiteness and blackness were created as a political economic structure. I'll say something more about that later. But in the second act, the binary is so powerful that that's what people see. And if you live, say, at the margins of that binary, you simply don't count. And this invisibility is structured in so many parts of our society, certainly in academia. The common occurrence in academia, everything from, this is something the great race theorist Paul Gilroy refers to as the absurdities of race, is, you have terms like BIPOC, which have it built-in rank ordering of racial groups. And somehow we think that this logically or morally makes sense to do. And so you, as an Asian American, you suffer under those realities. You suffer under meetings when you say, we're going to look for diverse candidates, and they don't at all mean people like you, even though Asian Americans are as underrepresented, even in the sciences and in the humanities, but we just don't tend to think so because we also peddle something that's referred to as the model minority myth, that like people like me are always doing well, even though empirically that's just not the case. And so you have a meeting around diversity and people will talk about it, you're in the room and you just don't count. But what I've also found is not simply that you don't count, this is still in the second act, is that if you do count, you're counted suspiciously because you're seen as white adjacent. And so you're seen in the same way, say, that a race traitor is seen. You're seen as, say, somehow benefiting from the realities of racism, even though you may or you may not, you're seen this way. And so it's not simply that you're invisible, but you're given a kind of problematic visibility. The third act in this story is the one that I've lived the last few years, is that you will pay some significant costs to call out the first two, to give attention to it, because you will not be, you are neither positioned to challenge the white nationalism, nor are you in a position to challenge the kinds of marginalizing forms of anti-racism. And so there are severe consequences. And I would say most Asian Americans, I would say this is probably true, I'm guessing, of Latinx communities, Hispanic communities, that we intuitively know this third reality, and that there are all constant forms of self-censoring going on in terms of the kind of racial politics that take place on college campuses across the country. So that's the kind of biographical background. The book comes out of both the biographical experience within racism, but more so in recent years, the second and third act, the recognition of the deep forms of marginalization, the fraught reality that marginalization in some ways is necessary to give proper attention to anti-blackness and to the dignity and power of black life. But say the freighted and weighted and confused and difficult reality of existing in the second act. And then more so in the third one, that there are significant consequences to be paid if you challenge the paradigm status of specifically the second reality. So what is the book saying? Well, it's important to say that the book, whatever it argues from the experience or the perspective or the angle given to me by living through these first three things. And writing the book, I tried to imagine the experience of Asian Americans as a kind of miner's canary in the American conversation around race. So if Asian Americans are the miner's canary, then what's the mine? It's how we talk about race and racism in this country. And I wanted to think hard about what happens to that canary when floated down this mine. And so the book was the attempt to do that. And the operative word was to release. Because part of the reality of what I will call identitarian ways of thinking about anti-racism is that we're given a story that the only way we'll be able to protect ourselves, say against, white nationalism, is to double down on our own forms of racial nationalism, right? So it's a story where the white nationalism is so powerful that we minorities are told the only way we'll be able to survive it is to double down on our own forms of race nationalism. The question I wanted to ask is, how far is that getting us? It seems to me to reinscribe the same problem, to re-essentialize or reduce people to questions or identities of race, where what we need to be perpetually doing is destabilizing race as an explanatory category. In the academic world, it feels to me that we're going the other direction here. So what does the book argue? So the book argues that in some sense, while we like to talk a big game about race as systemic and structural, that we haven't quite come to terms with what that quite means. That we tend to remain bidden, we continue to be committed, we continue to believe a story of racism, that racism is primarily an individual affair, it's primarily about prejudice, it's primarily about things I believe about other people, say people of color, that then sometimes leads to problematic behavior, but it's first and foremost an individualist affair. And these bad beliefs, say I believe Asians are viruses, or I think that X community is, they're dumb. These individual beliefs then lead to problematic behaviors, racist behaviors, and then sometimes these racist behaviors rise to the level of structures and systems in ways that they affect our institutions. This is a story that even while we talk about structural and systemic racism, we largely subscribe to this largely individualist account. I think that story is both incredibly convenient in that it allows us to largely go on with life as usual. And I believe that story largely has it backwards. In my account, racism isn't sometimes structural or systemic. That's what racism is. It is a system and structure, and none of this is particularly new to anything this book has said. This is something, say, Black Marxists have been arguing for about 100 years in this country. That racism, right, is in its most powerful and pervasive sense, is a structure and system of dehumanizing, breathtaking inequality, extraordinary forms of exploitation, incredible forms of domination. And race is then used as an ideological description or cover to lend that world some veneer of respectability. If that is the case, then pursuing the individual account or pursuing things simply through individual means, and this is what I would describe as almost the entirety of the DEI industry in this country, diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Much of that is simply barking up the wrong tree. And my sense is that's not an accidental feature of things, that's a necessary diversion. In the account I'm trying to propose is that if racism is in the ways we think about one another, our racist attitudes, even the stereotypes, if those are outcomes and byproducts of a system by which we need to believe those things in order to endorse and to continue to live in the world, if that's the case, then the question of rethinking how we're going to make this country, this world, a more just place is going to require serious questions about the very basic structures and systems that we occupy, and at least in my case, benefit from. And here I'm talking about housing, education, employment, healthcare, on down the line. So if you take this kind of macro account where racism is primarily what I describe as a gaslighting maneuver, right? I drive around East Waco and I noticed it's a food desert, there's no grocery stores, there's no financial industry there, there's no investment on the part of the city. These folks are disenfranchised politically through various forms of local political shenanigans. Instead of stepping back and saying, what kind of society are we that we would organize our world to do this, to allow this, to enable and perpetuate this, we'd make this move. And this is where the racism, as I described, follows. It doesn't lead. What we do is we say, well, it's because of them. It's natural to who they are. It's something about their race. In my description, racism persists because racism works. It perpetuates a society and a world that the rest of us get to live in. And then it comes with various forms of virtue signaling in ways that call out, say, individual forms of racism. And sometimes we operate and we go into these processes of canceling, calling out, shouting down. We do that all the while perpetuating the very system that we benefit and that keeps certain people marginalized and dominated by, say, political economic realities. The benefit of being Asian American is that, in a sense, it gets you behind the curtain on how these operations work. In some ways, it's not different than, say, think about Du Bois, right? Think about Cedric Robinson. Those folks looked at political economic situations and looked at how race was actually operating in the discourse. What Robinson saw in the UK was that race was not a distinction biologically, say, between Europeans and sub-Saharan Africans. Race was a labor distinction that allowed for certain kinds of Europeans to be distinguished from each other ideologically that then justified different kinds of labor distinctions. It's the same thing with colonial America. What you saw with the first uses of race language, the creation or the invention of white racial identity, these were labor distinctions, property distinctions. White people could be, say, temporary laborers as indentured workers. Black people were permanent slaves. And this is the milieu out of which race came to be, right? These are political economic stories. And what I'm trying to suggest is we need to get a bigger, broader angle on these questions. If all this is true, then it calls into question a lot of the ways that we currently think about race. One of the most prominent, I think, is the way of talking about white folks as if what the problem is essentially them being white. And you see forms of this way when academics talk about things like whiteness. The suggestion here is that, right, it's a failure to make a distinction between the racism that white people perpetuate without also saying, right, without preserving a critical distinction in saying it is because they're white that they do that. We need to both be able to tell the history of white racism, or white nationalism, or white supremacy, without telling that story in ways that re-essentializes racial categories into the being of certain kinds of people. What I try to say philosophically is race exerts very little explanatory power. But we keep on talking about race as if it does explain things. And my great worry is that if we do that in the name of, say, anti-racism, which is to say in the name of justice, we will simply have reinscribed the deep structural problems that got us to where we are today. I'll end a story. This is a gloomy story about how entrenched I think some of this is. So one of the things about the book is I've gone around to different universities or been invited to different universities to speak about the book. And I was at a prominent university in the Northeast. This university had just opened up for public lectures, and one of my stars, Asian American theorist, was one of my heroes was there in the audience, and she raised her hand and she said, I really love the book. I love what you're arguing. But here's the thing. At this university, there is a whole stratum of deans. And to bring people like you to this campus to talk about this, I need to talk in race essential categories. I need to peddle the very diversity, DEI terminology that I know as a theorist is simply re-inscribing the same problems, because that's the structure of my university. I thought what was sad about that story was how common that was across the schools I went to. And so this is kind of returning to this question about the landscape, about the problem, say, on the left at this point, and say in academia, about how the race categories continue to operate in deeply problematic ways. So.
Thank you, Jonathan. Eva, you want to weigh on that? The oppressed dynamic and how that sort of structures university life, and pulling it back with what Jonathan just returned to?
One story to tell here. So maybe I'll tell a story and then I'll raise a question, which maybe I'll do three things. Maybe I'll make three moves. First of all, thank you for your presentation. Yeah. Move number one, so similar to the story you just told about this, the prominent university in the Northeast and the way the landscape is structured. Just to underscore that it indicates this is not just kind of an intellectual paradigm, which is powerful enough, right? But it now structures how things operate. It now structures how things operate. So here's an illustration of that. So I gave a talk very similar to the one that I just gave here about a year ago at a conference of university administrators. I was actually I tread much more lightly than I did here, right? I'm accused after that talk of being totally out of my depth on diversity and not knowing what I'm talking about at all. I know, like, this is just not a fight to fight. Like, don't talk about the number of books I've written on this, blah, blah. Like, it's like, if you get to accuse me, I could never in a million years accuse you of being out of your depths, right? Like, stand up and reference, I'm curious how you think about how Jeff Stout and John Courtney Murray and Daniel Allen might think about this. And if you're like, I've never heard of those theorists, I would have no way I'd be able to say you're out of your depths on this, right? But because I said something outside of the power, privilege, and oppression paradigm, again, similar to my talk here, I get to be accused of that, right? Whatever. Just the personal slight thing is not the issue there. It's just how powerful the paradigm is. How powerful the paradigm is. Second thing that happens after this conference is somebody comes up to me and says, the way we get money, this is directly to your point, as a Muslim Students Association at Northwestern, I want to be specific about this, right? Elite top 20 private university in Chicago. The way we get money from student government is by writing an application of how deeply marginalized we are in the culture. And then we get money to do our programs. I'm like, you don't front like how big the event is gonna be, how many people it's gonna serve, like how it's grown in sophistication over the years, whatever. That's not the deciding factor. That feels to me to be a problem. Talking about this with Becca earlier, right? These people, we are the winners in the early 21st century. If you're at Northwestern, right, like, and your life proceeds reasonably apace of being at a top 20 private university, you won the lottery in a knowledge economy. And if the structural paradigm is you will be rewarded financially for telling a story of how oppressed you are, what about the 99% of our country that doesn't get into Northwestern? That doesn't get into Northwestern, right? Like, if that is the structural, if that is the way things are structured for the winners, how does the rest of the country view it? And I think my second point as relates to this, which I just do not understand about higher ed in a sector that I love and I'm deeply intimate with. I spent half of my professional time in higher ed. There is an identity that gets you into the door in higher ed. And it is not race, gender, or sexuality. It's, do you have a PhD? And what I just don't understand is why the kind of proto-Marxist analysis is constantly done about race, gender, and sexuality, but never about being book smart in the knowledge economy. I mean, never. When it's actually like really obvious. There's not a single job ad in America that requires race or gender, right? Maybe some that implicitly require sexuality, but there are all kinds of job ads that require college degrees. And at a university, like that's the only thing. So what's all this talk about like race structuring? Why aren't we talking about an entire society structured on being book smart in the knowledge economy? And the deep and ugly and murderous unfairness of that.
All right, well, if that's not enough to stir the pot, we're in the wrong room. Over to you. Who's up first? And Jonathan says in his wonderful book, which I have read, that you've got basically a camp that does color-blindness. That's their view of race, and another camp that says race is your ethnic identity. Your ethnic identity is your identity. And then we have to get better than that. And he basically calls at the end of the book for sort of modest measures in political economy that are a little bit more practical and a little bit more down to earth. And who's up? Is it Sewell Chan? From the Texas Tribune, editor-in-chief. Just hit that a little bit. It's not quite yet on. Melinda, can you nudge that? It's like, boom. It's right in the front, I think.
Hello? Oh, sorry. Well, first of all, thank you both so much. I've heard many discussions about race. Some of them have included Asian American themes. I've never heard, I don't think, two Asian American discussants ever engaging in such a profound and searching and provocative discussion. So I really, first of all, I'm very grateful. Give me a lot to think about. I guess one question for each of you. You know, for Jonathan, you question, for example, the shorthand term BIPOC, which, like all shorthand terms, is extremely simplistic and not my preference. But I'm the leader of a nonprofit organization with dozens of employees. And as an Asian American, I feel it's very, very incumbent upon me to try to bring people together, which I think is actually one of the advantages, perhaps, of being a member of a relatively small minority. And, you know, young people feel very strongly that Black and Indigenous perspectives need to be centered because those were America's original sins. It is interesting to me that Latinos and Asians are kind of incorporated into that shorthand. But is the hierarchy itself necessarily all that problematic, or rather how it is used?
Yeah, I mean, I take it this is the point Gilroy makes about the absurdities of race. What's absurd is that we both need it. It does work of the kind that you're talking about, but it also shoehorns us into an ongoing reality. So I've thought about trying to figure, my primary area of research is actually not race, it's in philosophy of language. And so I've tried to think about linguistically how we might think differently about this. If we could add just little qualifiers into what we mean. Because without those qualifications, you maybe actually think that BIPOC is saying more than maybe what you're trying to do with it, say, right? So when I say I'm Asian American, it's hard not to use that without the locution suggesting that's something essential about who I am, versus I'm racialized as an Asian American. I'm identified as, or I identify with. So how do we begin to break up some of the language, right, that opens up, aerates the descriptions that we give? The problem with BIPOC is it comes with exactly the political freight that some people want it to have. It also does the work that you're talking about. And that's what I mean by the absurdity of it, right? We both need it, and we both can't live without it, but I don't know that we can live long with it.
Thank you. My one question for you, if you don't mind.
Ibu, you talk about the centrality of class and opportunity, which I think is actually probably the biggest challenge of our times. I mean, mobility, economic opportunity, the pursuit of the American dream, and the fact that people who were not good at filling in the right bubbles correctly with a number 2 pencil are denied a chance at a good middle-class life is a giant, as you say, murderous and inhumane problem. I think we were good at filling in the bubbles. It does not mean that we're morally more worthy. If, in fact, as you argue, faith groups have provided so much of the social service infrastructure in America, why are they not, in my view, a bigger part of the conversation around inequality and of both income and wealth?
I think that is a great point, and I think the direct answer to that is because they're not part of the conversation. They're very seldom part of the conversation, period, unless there's a controversy, right? Unless there's a controversy in the Roman Catholic Church or the Southern Baptist Convention, or again, like Islam and Muslims are made important by Islamophobia. But the fact is, if you think about everything from preschools to law schools, if you think about social services and addictions treatment, if you think about the whole range of civic things, and I'll tell you my definition of the civic. My definition of civic is, it is the place where people from different identities come together to do things that we think are generally good for the human condition, right? Health, recreation, literacy type education, and where the activity guides cooperative relationships, right? Coaches who vote differently tend to not fight in Little League Baseball because people generally agree that's a good thing to do, and because the activity guides cooperative relationships. By the way, this is like most of American life, right? This is most of American life. It is a treasure of our civilization. And faith groups provide an awful lot of that in cooperative ways. Again, think Habitat for Humanity, disaster relief, and YMCAs. I think you could see a huge part of that as some combination of a human development program and an economic mobility program, so to speak. And I just think we don't talk about it. So and I think asking, and I actually think you have more power, which is to say journalists have more power in whether that gets talked about than faith groups do. Like you want to call Rami Nashashibi Edaman to ask him how what he's doing is a Muslim version of class, of mercy plus class mobility. I promise you, he'll talk to you. I think in other words, your question is a very interesting question. I just don't think I'm the right person to ask it to.
Steph Kite. Axios.
Okay. Thank you both. This is really interesting. I do feel out of my depth, so I'm sorry if my question comes more out of just curiosity and uncertainty. And I feel like there's been some overlap in what each of you have said, but also feel like there's been kind of a different emphasis that I'm wanting to hear more about, where you've kind of spoken on like the need to move away from a paradigm of power, oppression, and privilege. But then there's also the element that you talked about, Jonathan, about the more systemic issues, which does that still fall under that paradigm to you? Do you feel like an emphasis on systemic racism in conversation is unhelpful, or do you agree that that's something that needs to be addressed and that there needs to be broader changes in that direction? And sorry if I've misunderstood anything either of you have argued.
Yeah, I've actually thought about this question because I've been reading Ibu's stuff, and I'm not quite sure where some of the differences lie. I think for me, there's a very strong emphasis on questions of political economy. I think that there is a development that follows the 1960s freedom struggles around the world, certainly focused also in America, where the response to contingencies and eventualities like those freedom struggles around gender, internationalism, certainly race, that the way that the country responds is by the creation of a massive neoliberal political economic infrastructure set against ever allowing that to happen again. And you see, Thatcher in the UK, Reagan in the US, an incredible contraction of class considerations. It's amazing that in the American discourse, how rarely class comes in and how suspiciously it's viewed whenever it does come in. Interestingly, this is also the period of the industry around diversity in the UK and in America. In the UK, it takes on the incredibly unfortunate name of racial awareness training, RAT. In America, it takes on the seemingly more innocuous name, DEI, or diversity initiatives, often tied to, say, certain title actions by the US government. But I can't help but seeing these developments as part and parcel with that larger neoliberal economy. Whatever Ibu meant by the meritocracy that crushes anyone without a certain kind of degree, that's the kind of thing I'm worried about. And I'm worried about the way race is all up in that. And so therefore, for someone like me to think through race, you have to think through all this stuff. The attempt to think about race, say isolating it to the antagonisms of particular racial identities, which is how we tend to do it, what I call identitarianism, without thinking about these realities, isn't simply a distraction. It is further warfare on these forms of, on these folks who suffer these realities.
Two quick comments. One is, I think that there's a huge shared part of our work, which Jonathan actually didn't talk about, his version of which is on religion.
Yeah.
And the entire second half of Jonathan's book is on, and some of the first half is on a Chinese American religious community and how the manner in which it operates just explodes the paradigm of anti-racism and how it seeks to model a different way of political economy, right? So that's a huge overlap in our work, and because Jonathan has many important things to talk about, he just didn't happen to talk about that. I think that, so part of what I am in the habit of doing is as soon as I believe in a paradigm, I do the Karl Popper thing and I start finding disconfirming evidence, right? So because I'm and I don't do this as a contrarian, I do this because I want to see what I really believe. And I just think this is how intellectuals ought to operate, right? You don't find more examples of what you believe in, you find examples of things that challenge what you believe in to sharpen what you believe in. So I want as a way of doing that in good faith and a sense of warmth, I want to raise up a couple of questions about Jonathan's paradigm of racialized political economy and using Asian Americans as an example, right? So one of the interesting things about the late 20th and early 21st centuries is how Asian Americans become Republicans. Vietnamese Americans are probably the most Republican Asian American community, right? Amongst the poorest and most Republican. And one of the reasons for that is because of the political economy in the United States, particularly neoliberalism. And what do I mean by that, right? Basically in a very pedestrian way, you are, if you do well, there's two paths of this. One is the small business path, which is you can start your own small business, you can operate it the way that you want to, which by the way, I totally agree with you, in many cases is exploitative, right? But there's a legal structure. You can start your own small business. You can make a living off of it, right? I just want to point out something really basic. That is not possible in huge swaths of the earth. So if you come from a place in which you cannot start a small business, operate it the way that you want to, and make a living, and you come to a place where you can do that, why wouldn't you think it's paradise? And Asian American, sets of Asian Americans, my parents owned Subway sandwich stores growing up, have done well with that, right? So just want to encapsulate this for a second. A racial minority group, a non-white group came to America, played by the rules and succeeded. Again, I'm being contrary to my own center-left instincts here. I'm not being polemical for the sake of being polemical. The second path of that is obviously higher ed, right? So Asian Americans at elite universities, even confounding the massive attempts by those universities to limit our presence there, still are 3-to-1 disproportionate at Harvard, Chicago, Northwestern, Yale, et cetera, than our percentage in the general population. 25, 28, 30% at those places, 7 to 8% of the general pop. By the way, Caltech, which doesn't really attempt to deflate Asian numbers, it's like 50%. So again, tell the story, right? Like, if you live in a country in which your race has like structurally held you back, right? Like Hindu caste system held you back. And you come to a country where it's like, hey, do well in school and you will go far, and you do it, why wouldn't you think it's paradise?
Yeah, when I thought about this set of questions, there was a part of me, I admit, that thinks, okay, in thinking with, and where I differ with Ibu on some of these questions, especially about, say, businesses, because the book is divided into two parts. One is an oral history of this really amazing history that maybe some of you know about, of Chinese migrants during the Reconstruction era, ending up in the Deep South in Mississippi, and largely as replacement laborers, as planters are looking to enslave or get free labor all over again. They end up there, they leave the plantations, but they stay there for the next, they're still there. And the way they survive, and in many cases thrive, is by creating businesses that exploit the conditions of food deserts, created as a function of white racism and white racist political economies. And while that story has often been celebrated as a story of diversity, say Asian people in the South, I tell the story as what it means to operate as people of color within a racial political economy. That it's very hard to succeed without forms of exploitation, of taking advantage of inheriting and taking advantage of forms of racial injustice and inequality. I try to say that the deadly phenomenon along issues of political economy and race isn't always exclusion. It's actually problematic forms of inclusion. It's what the theorist at Princeton, Keeanga Yamada Taylor, calls predatory inclusion. So rather than telling the story of racism through, say, redlining mortgage workers, I'm much more interested in telling the story of the exploitation of Black Americans through the real estate industry, which is, as many of us know, at the beginnings of the 2008 recession, as the federal government mandated the mortgage industry to underprivileged communities. And so I'm much more worried about that. So when I thought about all of my commitments, and I know Ibu played a critical role in the Obama administration, part of me was thinking my differences with Ibu here, maybe my differences with President Obama, who I have an incredible amount of admiration for. But I think that may be some of the differences is what hopes I put in terms of the economy, in terms of correcting for some of its own problems. There are friends of mine in the world of economics that think I went way too far in following the Black Marxists. And then there are democratic socialist friends of mine that said I did not go nearly far enough. Because the second half of the book is the articulation of a for-profit software company in conjunction with a local church, in conjunction with an elementary school that seeks to redistribute money made through the software company in the local neighborhood, which is the most marginalized part of San Francisco, the Bayview Hunters Point, which is just about an hour from here. So I tried to tell that story and how Christianity is running through that. And then my democratic socialist friends are like, well, you didn't go far enough. Because this is just perpetuating or further participating in the market economy. So I'd like to say I'm somewhat in the middle on some of these questions, but that's also to say that people would critique me for not going far enough one way or the other.
So I want to underscore something that I think could get too easily elided, right? And I'm so glad that we're at a place where we are supposed to talk about religion. So what you do in that second half of the book, Jonathan, is you say, people voluntarily, I think this is so important, right? Because so much of the kind of national conversation is, what should the government do? And that is not the only important thing in a democracy, right? A hugely important thing in a democracy is, what do identity groups that make material moves in civil society do? And so what I love about like civil society and identity groups is, you come up and you're like, I have a more ethical way of doing something. And you know what? I'm not gonna tell other people how they're wrong. And my first move is not gonna be to pass laws on this, right? Because honestly, that's its own process and it's a lot of time. And truth be told, I do this out of a matter of conscience, right? So this is not necessarily like a model for a national economy. This is what I am moved to do as a Christian or a Muslim. And I'm just gonna do it. I'm just gonna do it, right? And I think this is kind of my model for a diverse democracy. It's not, the first instinct isn't always, which law should we pass in Congress to change the way things work nationally? Now, for some things, yes, right? But my first instinct is, who out of their conscience and set of ethics and identity has a better way of doing something that helps people? Let's facilitate them doing it, and then let's encourage others to do that. It's kind of a Habitat for Humanity way of doing things. And incidentally, like the paradigm I use in my book around this is Jane Addams and Hull House in the late 19th, early 20th century. And what I point out is she basically models just about every important national policy that the progressive movement then passes 10 or 20 years later. She basically models in education, in health, in labor, in civic cooperation. She says, we're gonna build it here at Hull House. So one quick example on this. They do a survey of the near west side of Chicago where they live. There are only 3 bathtubs in the whole neighborhood, so they build public baths. There are something like 7,000 school-age kids, but only 3,000 spots in classrooms, so they build classrooms, right? And the notion is not just, we're gonna be a utopian model apart for things. It's no, we're going to do a set of things that work out of a Christian humanist ethic, and then we're gonna encourage other people to do more, right? And I think that is just such an advantage of what I call civic religious pluralism, which is actually how our civil society functions. And it strikes me that there is, I think in the kind of communitarian moment, so to speak, in the 1990s when philosophers talked more about communitarianism, that was elevated more to kind of a national discourse. But it strikes me the level of importance it plays in American life and the volume it registers at in the national conversation just seem to be inversely correlated.
It's a line. Let's return, if we can, to McKay Coppins from The Atlantic, who has a question.
Okay. This is a question for Ibu, but I would also be interested in Jonathan's thoughts on this. Ibu, when you were talking about the kind of the religious pluralism and its civic good and the miracle of religious pluralism and various religious groups working together and cooperating, it made me wonder how you think that the diversity initiatives that are being undertaken in organizations across the country, in particular in newsrooms, which most of us belong to, should be thinking about religious diversity. Is that something that newsrooms and broader, more broadly companies, organizations, institutions, should they be trying to fold religious diversity into their DEI efforts? Are there any pitfalls of that? How should organizations think about the kinds of diversity that they care most about and are trying to encourage?
Thank you. So, is this on?
It is, yes.
People here? Okay, great. So I think it's 2 different questions, right? How does a newsroom think about religion? In a DEI initiative that is about the mission of the newsroom which is how do we best understand American society, right? And then how might a different kind of organization think about religion if it's doing the DEI, attempting to do the DEI work of like a more equitable workplace? I think those are two different questions. So I'm going to address the first one first, and so I don't bore myself with my own voice. I'll then just turn it over to Jonathan and see what he wants to talk about. So I think the answer to the question is if you have no feel for the role of religion, of religious identity and religious institutions in a community, you are likely to miss a ton, and in embarrassing ways, right? So let me give you an example of this. So the Public Religion Research Institute,
He's got it.
Public Religion Research Institute and my organization, Interfaith America, we did 3 surveys on how religious identity impacted how people viewed COVID and particularly the vaccine, right? And it turns out actually that of like 10 different quote unquote religious interventions that we asked about, if your church or mosque held a vaccine clinic, would you be more likely to get the vaccine? If your pastor or imam spoke about the vaccine as a religious requirement, would you be more likely to get the vaccine? Some combination of those 10, some combination of 3 or 4 of those, right? Which is how things happen in religious communities. Nothing just happens singly, right? It's your pastor speaks about the vaccine and you have a vaccine clinic, and you have a town hall about it. It would have made a difference for about 50% of Americans, right? And so if you don't have any feel for that, first of all, and part of what journalists do, so much of it is feel and intuition. It's like, what information should, I wonder if race impacts how people view the vaccine. Okay, so you go look for that. I wonder if religion impacts that. If you're not even asking that question, if that's not like part of your mental operation at all, you're going to miss a ton. And the way that we wound up putting this in the various reports and op-eds and stuff we wrote is there are many cases in which a doctor will say to a patient, for your heart condition, you need to stop eating foods A, B, and C and start eating foods X, Y, and Z. And the patient won't listen. But that very same person, when she is a congregant at a church and the pastor says, for your spirit condition, you need to stop eating X, Y, Z and start eating A, B, C, she will do it. We ought to pay attention to that. That is a material fact. Right? That's a material fact of American life. And I think that reporters ought to have so much of this is about what are you paying attention to? What's on your natural radar screen? And if that's not on it, you're just going to miss a lot.
In general, it's not clear that diversity initiatives, and I can mostly or maybe only speak in the context of, say, universities, it's not clear that they actually do what they want to do. They don't make them more diverse places. In fact, studies show that they are counterproductive, that over 10 years, places become less diverse. And there's some study on why that's the case. But in my mind, the concern may be a deeper problem with whether, even if they did work, they do much more than diversify elite spaces that go on and perpetuate larger systems of injustice. That's the deeper problem. But at least on the surface problem of whether they make places more diverse, there's not a lot of evidence. And one of the things I found striking in the research is how rarely institutions ask whether they work before they implement them. And almost every institution at this point in American life institutes them, and they mandate them. And these are protocols and procedures that bring an amazing amount of heat that seem to do very little work. But then again, that's the surface issue. There's a deeper issue about whether they actually get to questions of redistribution, reparation, repair, address, these kinds of things.
All right, let's pivot to this side of the room. We're teaming up with the photography team a little differently today. So we've got Becca, Shadi, Amy. But maybe let's go Amy first. I think that's the part of the deal. Amy, up.
Thank you. Ibu, I wanted to talk a little bit about development that could really dramatically affect the way our civil spaces are set up, and see to what extent that would affect interfaith cooperation in civic life, and what opportunities there might be for interfaith institutions to be able to take advantage of this possible chance to remake what the civic square looks like. And that is the fact that for a number of reasons, some of them economic, some of them migration, people just moving to many more urban areas, and some of it, the change in church membership. We are going to see over the next decade a huge selling off of church buildings, particularly in smaller towns. And as you alluded to in your talk, these are places that house preschools, they house support groups, they house job training in a lot of cases. Since the founding of America as a set of colonies, our civic life has been built around these buildings, and not just in their religious forms, but as kind of foundations of our communities. And you could see, lead to a hollowing out of our civic life, even more than some would argue we are right now. But I guess I'm curious to think about ways that we could do something new and the role that interfaith cooperation could play in that.
Thank you for that. I think it's a great question. So I will say a few things about the dark part of this, and then I think lean into your hopeful vision, which is, for whatever reason, I'm congenitally inclined towards optimism. So I'm very happy to lean into that. But look, I have been the guy who's spoken at some small town college in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Indiana or Minnesota, I don't know, a few dozen times. And then the local church says, will you, after your 6 p.m. talk at the college, will you come for a 9 p.m. event at the church? And I'm always sure. And there's 11 people there, right? And that happens a lot. And I think to myself, the only reason this place is just going on inertia, and at some point that's going to stop. And that's actually the case with a lot of civic institutions. So there are a number of small independent colleges, several hundred, who lose money or break even every year, and it's just a grind. It's just exhausting. And I don't know how much longer those places continue. And I don't know how much, there was just did you people see the piece in the New York Times about the woman who owned the bar in this small town in Nebraska, a town of 130 people. She's 88 years old. She owns the bar, and she's like the registrar of the county and the mayor of the town. And basically, when she retires or dies, it's just everything is gone. It's just done. And she continues to come to work at 88 because she's like, well, I am it. That is a lot of small town churches. It's 3 people who are I'm going to keep this place going, and 15 people who are whatever you do, I'm going to show up. Russell is nodding. That is a lot of small town churches, right? It's Lutheran churches, it's Methodist churches, it's Presbyterian churches. And when those things go, that is very sad, because it is 15 people who show up, for the regular Wednesday night events, and you think to yourself, is this really worth it? But when there's a tragedy in that town, 1,100 people show up, and they need that place. They need that place, right? So what's the optimistic version of this? The optimistic version is that the fledgling Buddhist, Hindu, Baha'i, Muslim community around that small Indiana town within 50 square miles that have moved there for all kinds of different reasons, from the meatpacking factory to the IBM little wing there. They're like, hey, we could use that building. None of us can buy it on our own, but we could share it. I mean, do I think that could happen? I think that could happen in some dozens of places. Is it likely to be the new norm in America? It's probably logistically hard, but I think you could see dozens of examples of those over the next 10 or 15 years. I will say one last thing on this, which is one of the reasons I refer so often to the late 19th and early 20th century is because of two people, Julius Rosenwald and Jane Addams. Julius Rosenwald is the Jewish philanthropist who built 5,000 black schools. Jane Addams is the Christian humanist who built the civic institution, which was basically the model for 20th century American democracy, from the Progressive Era to the New Deal. And I basically think we are living in an era of melt, and we need 1,000 of each of those. We need 1,000 Julius Rosenwalds to fund a new civic infrastructure and 1,000 Jane Addams to build it.
I might remind us in holding up your wonderful book that Shaddy wrote the piece "America Without God" in April of 2021, if I recall, and it talks about the sort of cascade down from 70-ish% that were, thanks to Gallup and Pew, connected in this institutional membership way to their congregation to now under 50, and that's a change. But maybe that's a good pivot to him. Shaddy, you're up.
Yes, a comment and a question. I mean, first thing, Iba, I was struck by what you said about the relationship between Islam and Islamophobia, and how, in some sense, it's anti-Muslim sentiment that helped Muslims feel more Muslim and actually made our own identities more salient in the Trump era. And also there's a partisan component that, it feels very remote now, but there was a time when sort of ostentatious displays of solidarity with Muslims was a way to communicate one's dislike of Trump. So during the Muslim ban, we were the center of attention for a certain period of time. And it was a way, I don't want to say it was virtue signaling, because it was nice for Muslims to feel virtue signaled too. But the reason I bring this up is because I think there's been a very striking shift in just the past few years where Muslims went from being the center or one of the centers of attention to almost being forgotten. Like no one really talks at least in the American context, Islam and Muslims are not particularly salient anymore. And part of that is because of Donald Trump. He stopped talking about Islam and Muslims somewhere around 2019. I'm not saying purposely, he just maybe lost interest, but also because something replaced it. I mean, just the rise of wokeness as the new threat and critical race theory and all these things just sort of displaced, I think, some of the kind of pre-2020 concerns in a very interesting way, which is good in a way for Muslims because we feel more normal. But I also can't help but feel that there's also a sense of loss that for those of us who came of age post 9/11, my whole adult life, Muslims have been very central and Islam has been very central. It's only in the last 2 years in my entire adult life that I've actually felt for the first time that we no longer matter as much. And I think that for some people that's great, obviously, but there's also something where people will not find, they're losing a sense of their identity because there's not as much bigotry. So it's not a fully formed thought, but it's just been, it just made me, what you said made me think about that. And it's also worth noting that it's just like a funny, delicious irony that the person who might become the first Muslim senator in American history will have become that thanks to Donald Trump. And that's so I'm referring here to the great Dr. Oz. So that's also, it shows that something has really changed where that doesn't even seem so surprising to us anymore, that Donald Trump would be the reason behind it. So that's just a comment. And then just a question, I guess it's more towards Jonathan, but maybe Ibu, you have thoughts on this as well. And I guess we started talking about this over dinner last night, but so, I'm just thinking on the political economy focus or even the class focus, I think it makes a lot of sense, intuitively, and I think even empirically in different contexts. But when you look at societies that have much lower levels of inequality than we do, whether it's in Western Europe, but also I guess Brazil, India, and Philippines obviously have very high levels of inequality, but maybe in a different way. But you have these very different kinds of societies economically, but they all seem to have the rise of identitarianism and the rise of far-right populist politics in one way or the other. So it seems to argue that there's something about America's hyper-inequality that drives this. I think it doesn't necessarily get us closer to explaining what seems to me to be a universal phenomenon. And I'm just curious, what you would say to that if you're trying to make sense of it. Obviously, it's hard to isolate the variables, but if class is the primary explanatory variable, or inequality, or however we want to describe this, I think it's complicated by the broader story that in very different kinds of economies, but also let's say in the Middle East, which has a very different kind of economic structure, we see religious identity being, very predominant. And in this, I'm just talking about the divide between Islamists and secularists. So we see identity expressed in all these different ways, and class concerns being essentially pushed to the side. Which I suppose raises the broader question: if class isn't salient, maybe it's because most people just don't find class salient in all these different societies, and then we have to ask ourselves, why is that the case, even in places where class considerations you'd think would be very effective? So in the Middle East during the Arab Spring, people said that economic concerns were paramount, but no one organized politically around those economic concerns. It all went back to things like Sharia. What role do we want religion to play in public life? And that could lead us to some sort of false consciousness arguments that people, for whatever reason, people didn't realize that they were being distracted from what really mattered. But that's just a diversion. I'm curious how you would reflect on that and what that tells us about class analysis more broadly.
Sure. I mean, just to your comments to Ibu about Islam, one of the things that Trump started talking about, 2019, 2020 were Asians, Kung flu, China virus, this kind of thing. And there was this, I could certainly speak to the Asian American dynamic more, but there's a similar dynamic that there was a kind of resurgence of kind of Asian American racial nationalism as a bulwark against the onslaught of, as Russell Jung has documented, near 12,000 reported cases of anti-Asian violence at this point, or racism. So there's a similar dynamic within the Asian American context. It's a little unclear what Asian American identity names, what it picks out or captures. If I speak about being Vietnamese American, I speak about a language, a food or a cuisine or a history. Asian American, it's a little bit more nebulous what that names. So anyways, so as to the question, that's why I always talk in terms of political economy, never just economy, right? So it's economy integrated to power, culture, and so and how people parse it out and what they rest their case and make their cases on. With the example that you talked about, certainly is different parts of that dynamic. But I'm probably not like those who say everything could be understood through class. It's a lot more could be understood by thinking a little bit more about class. That's the argument, right? And interestingly, race in America has largely been thought about separate from questions of class. This was certainly not always the case, right? So, Ibu's written about him a lot as well, but say Bayard Rustin, right? Bayard Rustin understood this as deeply integrated. And there's a moment in civil rights where this is a heated debate within the movement. Can we push the question of race internal to its political economic reality? So is civil rights, is the outcome, the projection, the deliverable of civil rights also tied to questions of poverty? Or do we need to make some political compromises because we can offend so many people by bringing in the class question? Should we narrow it simply to, say, the race question? This is Matt Brunig has recently done work on this, the distinction between thinking about the racial wealth gap and the wealth gap as such. And what are the proper remedies when you think about it one way or the other? So yeah, so it's certainly the attempt to say we need to think through class, but I'm certainly aware of the kind of problematic that you put on the table, which is it can't be reduced to class. That's why to me it's political economy. It's not, say, just neoliberal capitalism, it's racial capitalism, right? It's the entwinement of economy, politics, culture, right? All the ways that these produce what I would describe as a diseased racial imagination by which we understand other human beings. So
can I have a little bit of fun?
Yeah, please.
So, given that Asian Americans are quite dramatically overrepresented at elite universities, right? And again, it's kind of 3 to 1. Between 25 and 30% of the Ivy League and et cetera, et cetera. It also means that they're dramatically overrepresented, at least at the lower levels of consulting companies and investment banks. And part of what consulting companies do is, I'm just going to put it bluntly, they unemploy people. They close factories down. So, and a lot of the people who work at those factories are white people, not exclusively, but this is like the political economy of white working class America. I'll never forget this. This is 2016. It's right before Donald Trump becomes the nominee. It's like April or something like that, April or May of 2016. I fly into Newark Airport. I'm in the back of a black car on my way to give a talk about race at Princeton. And the driver, white working class guy, and I are having a friendly conversation. He's a Trump supporter. I'm like, you seem to be too nice of a guy to be a Trump supporter, blah, blah, blah. He's like, why are you going to Princeton? We're kind of having this friendly, semi-searching conversation. And then he tells me, he's like, I used to work at a factory making seatbelts. I've made up to $35 an hour. And then a bunch of guys who look like you closed my factory down. And you know what? He's probably right.
Yeah.
What did he mean by books?
I mean, I'm an Indian American in the back of his car on the way to Princeton, and he's basically like, a team of people who look like you came to my factory, and they're the ones who unwound the factory.
Did he mean people wearing suits and ties?
No. He meant Asian Americans with elite degrees going to Princeton. And he just said it descriptively. Not a lot of venom in his voice, right? And totally plausible, right? These are our friends, right? These are the people we went to grad school with. These are the people on my board. So, I mean, I'm asking an obvious question vis-a-vis your very important framework.
Yeah.
What is our role in the racialized political economy of American meritocracy vis-a-vis the white working class?
Yeah, so for those of you that are aware of the literature, Asian American studies focuses a lot on what's called the model minority myth. And in some ways, I want to say almost the entirety of Asian American studies is in a kind of committed battle with the model minority myth. So the model minority myth was first penned by a sociologist at Berkeley named William Peterson, who said, this is in the height of the 1960s. And it was clearly a disciplinary move against black folks. It was saying, well, look at these Japanese Americans. Over against all the oppression and marginalization, they've succeeded. Y'all black people ought to, get on board with being minorities in this way. This is what makes them models. So Asian Americans have been at war with this forever. And so the response to Ibu would be to say, wow, Asian Americans are disproportionately represented among elite universities. Well, let's drill down on the numbers. And that's really only specific Asian Americans, not, only 20% or something like that of Vietnamese Americans go to college and this kind of thing. So that's been the move. But I don't think that the most perilous or, say, nefarious problem with the model minority myth is that it gets Asian Americans wrong, though I think it does. Even that it disciplines people. The thing I'm really worried about is the way that the model minority myth actually tempts Asians into its story and says that this is the trajectory of your life in America. and in ways that you can only achieve the burden of the myth, this level of success, exactly by living out versions of the story this person had, which is participating in forms of injustice, forms of exploitation, all under the kind of banner of diversity, right? Because you're not only running or closing the factories, you're now a person of color, and it makes us feel better about this. So I'm worried about kind of the ways it draws Asian Americans, the model minority myth, into a kind of script for their lives that put them on, say, pathways to the elite universities, and then at the upper echelons of a society that drives incredible forms of inequality. So I'm equally worried about that as well.
Yep,
and we're going to flip. Yep.
I have a hard time saying that a national framework of political economy should have a different logic than meritocracy. This is why I think religion is so powerful.
That's right.
Right? Because it is an alternative narrative for what a good life is that I think it's very dangerous to write into national law, so to speak, but it is very powerful for an individual or an identity community to consider as an alternative script for that. So I want my kids, for example, to basically think of two scripts. I think meritocracy is important. I want them to be the best basketball players and students and whatever that they can be. And Islam is really important. And there are points when those are deeply in tension, right? Often when it comes to which fruits will I pluck from the tree of meritocracy. But would I prefer that a school system or a university or an economy structured itself by a different line, that basically factories that were not profitable for a company were continued to run, because at some point then the company fails, right? So there is a brutality to that reality, and I just think that it is leavened by a different reality, and I think that religion is the most powerful alternative there.
Yeah, so
As you said earlier, and as you draw out in your divine economy part, so quick, and then let's go to Becca Rosen.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. And then I go back and forth on what types of interventions or remedies I think need to happen at the state and federal level. But this is why the question about civic life and local associational life is so critical to me. And it's exactly this, is that what you're going to lose in losing these local religious forms is alternative imaginations, different ways of imagining the world. So let's say, at least for the foreseeable future, we're going to live in a meritocracy that's neoliberal capitalism in its global form. What are the ways that local communities can cultivate alternative imaginations, both, say, for our kids that have to operate in multiple spaces, but also for communities to imagine? So what I try to do in the second half of the book is to try to give voice to a community in San Francisco that does this. They live in something I describe as a deep economy. They imagine the world is rife with justice and mercy because the world is God's world. And so for them, it never occurs to them to live differently than to live generously towards their neighbors. That's just what it means to be human beings as they understand it as Christians. And so the loss of these local communities then means the loss of these alternative imaginations, different ways of cultivating humanness in this world. And I think this is deeply critical. And that's what I think one of the most powerful things that religion gives us. And certainly I would say that for Christianity. So.
That's great. All right, hard stop at 3:45. We got 5 people up. Becca Rosen, Tim Alberta, Kelsey Dallas, Melanie Mason, McKay Coppins.
Hi, thank you both so much. I have a kind of odd question. I hope this comes out clearly. But I find this conversation fascinating. It's intellectually stimulating. I really enjoy it at the theoretical level. I will say that in my lived experience, when this conversation happens about inclusion and exclusion in an institution, it's often a lot less enjoyable. I've seen that these conversations just tear apart many institutions I've been involved in, my own synagogue, certainly many institutions that my friends are involved in. It's just a topic of constant conversation. And of course, these are institutional problems, but when you live through it, it's a personal problem. These are friendship problems. They are really hard emotionally, and people get very invested. And I guess my question is just, if you could reflect on that, what can we do to get better at these conversations? How do you cope with them emotionally, personally? And just how do we treat each other better when we're engaging in these conversations at the personal level?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I say. It's what I mean when I say, or at least the way I describe it, is that the conversations often bring a ton of heat, and it can't help but be personal and deeply interpersonal, right? In these conversations, the thing most of us are thinking about is, how do I not say the wrong thing? Right, and so the kind of heat then is almost the exact opposite of what we need to honestly engage with the human beings around us. And so that's part of the great challenge at this moment. And I'm not quite sure, especially in the age of social media, which we're really just beginning to come to terms with the ways it's affected the discourse. I mean, think about the conversation around CRT, right? And so it's kind of like, are you pro-CRT? Are you anti-CRT? It's an absurd way of thinking about it. I mean, it's like saying, I love cellular biology. I hate cellular. I mean, CRT names a wide discourse. Not everything that names itself cellular biology is good cellular biology, right? And so it's the same kind of thing. CRT is developed over decades. It's a serious intellectual discourse, and like any discourse, it has ranges of contribution. But it's become such a politicized concept that it then valorizes us into a conversation. So since I'm anti-blackness, I'm against anti-blackness, then I must be for CRT in every articulation of it, right? And then, so you think about the kinds of broad, sweeping ways that these conversations happen, and it's not clear to me at this point whether these conversations yield to anything at the end of the day other than recitals of white guilt. And maybe we think that in a world where there's so much white nationalism, white supremacy, we'll take some white guilt because it gets us somewhere. Well, it doesn't really address most of the issues that are most important to most of us, and we often know that. Maybe that's all we're willing to pony up on, right? Because at least it gives us something. That's the great worry at this point, is if we're just kind of cycling around these. And just to affirm what you said, I've certainly been in those conversations. You feel like something's getting done. You feel like you're self-censoring. It's very intense. It's very heated. At the end of the day, the result is maybe you had less friendships than you did before.
So what I find useful is just reminding myself of the different eras that I've lived through myself. I'm 46, adult life, whatever, 25 years. I've probably lived through 6 different historical moments in terms of like, what was the operating paradigm? So we used to live in the Obama era, where it was just common to have a center-left person who stood up and said, I took off of my website everything that was snarky about the pro-life position, because the truth of the matter is I admire the position, I just don't hold it, and so much of who I am is because of what I learned from the sisters on the south side of Chicago when I was an organizer, right? We used to live in a moment where somebody said that and was widely celebrated for it. I mean, I'll give you other examples. Like, we used to live in the Mandela moment, right? Where it was widely celebrated that a man would come out of prison after 27 years and put on the jersey. There's a movie made about this. Put on the jersey of the hated white Afrikaans rugby team and change that symbol from a racist symbol into a rainbow symbol, and say things like the most dangerous person is the humiliated man, even if he deserves to be humiliated. So we've lived through those different moments not that long ago. I think operating paradigms don't last forever. This one is going to change too. I hope it doesn't change to something worse, right? I'll end this like little segment with this provocation. Remember the film Dead Man Walking? Yeah. Could that film be made now? What's the movie about? The movie is about a Catholic sister developing deep sympathy for a white racist rapist. That's what that movie is about.
I like to think if Susan Sarandon were still around, it could be made. It was a wonderful film.
It was a wonderful film. Yes. Susan Sarandon does a lot for it. But that's what the movie is about.
Sean Penn, on the other hand.
That's what the movie is about. And it is extolling the deeply religious virtue of forgiveness, even in the face of things you shouldn't forgive. I'm going to say straight, forget how celebrated the movie was, which, I don't know how many awards it won, right?
could that movie be made today? And therefore, could the conversations it necessarily generated about mercy, death penalty, crime be raised, right? That's part of the problem of the discourse. So imagine you're raised in a steady diet of being critical of everything, right? And there's a movement afoot within academia. It's called post-critique that's also deeply worried about this. But let's just say you're raised in a steady diet of seeing everything in deeply suspicious terms. Do you ever produce a movie like that? Do you ever tweet that it's a great movie? The community in San Francisco, or any number of communities that we are all inspired or that do amazing work, do they get off the ground? Or is our posture towards them, well, there's got to be some white supremacy going on somewhere here. Maybe there is. That's the work we need to do on the ground and figure out. But there's a critical posture that we are now inhabiting, and I hope it's just a momentary thing, but it's deeply debilitating in terms of the ability to put skin in the game and offer a productive, constructive set of possibilities.
Matt, we're just going to pile on to your awesome question. About a decade ago, I explored a role as a headmaster of a school. And this guy who was smart and wise in my faith tradition basically said, and this is the thing about journalists, right? Journalists, more profit, there's more truth, there's more, and I got the best job in the world now. I get to know a bunch of journalists, right? Different personalities are going to answer this differently. But on the question you specifically asked, in my faith tradition, we've got the idea of prophet, priest, and king, all being functions of what we do in life. And so if you're prophetic and if you're a columnist, like Molly isn't, you're always sort of speaking, truth for the. If you're a king, you're running an organization. And you got organizational questions to ask, like Ibu. It's hard. It's an organizational function. But this guy suggested that the role of a headmaster in a little school was mostly priest. And his idea was, your job really isn't so much writing the manual. It's mostly taking on the pain of other people upon yourself and then just giving it over to God. And then they can go away free, and you can go away free. So I thought that was an interesting nudge. And I just think this hard conversation is replete with that. Tim, Alberta.
Guys, hear me? Thank you both for having this conversation. I'm glad I've been running my recorder, and I'm going to listen to it again on the flight home. Some of us are not Rhodes Scholars, so it's going to take 2 or 3 listens to fully digest some of this, but it's really been excellent. At the risk of being reductive, let me ask you something. You talked about the operating paradigm, this moment that we're living through right now, and so much of the emphasis on race, racial identity, and the challenge of de-emphasizing, or as you said, Jonathan, I think you said, I wrote it down somewhere, destabilizing race as an explanatory category. So none of this can be discussed in a vacuum because, of course, the world is changing, the country is changing very, very quickly. I'm old enough to remember being a kid and having people in the community upset that there were signs going up, Spanish language signs going up at the grocery store or on the bus route or whatever, right? And today in the United States, we have 6 states that are majority minority. We'll have another 6 or 7 by the end of the decade. The country will be majority minority within a couple of decades. And of course, on top of that, you have an increasing number of Americans identifying as mixed race. You have rising rates of interracial marriages. And so you alluded a minute ago, Ibu, to this question an open question of where this goes from here. We're in this moment now with so much of this emphasis on DEI and CRT and being an ally and social justice and white privilege, white fragility, all of this, right? And I think about a lot of this as a dad. I've got 3 mixed race kids, and are they oppressor or are they oppressed? I think 2 of them are the oppressed, one's the oppressor. The middle one is the oppressor. But that's just personality types. But seriously, my wife and I talk about this, and I'm struck by something that's a little bit worrisome. On the one hand, I think to myself, in an America that is moving closer and closer to some sort of racial parity, so to speak, at least statistically, maybe this will be de-leveraged, this will be de-emphasized. But the other part of me wonders that if, in fact, this moment we're living in right now is in some way a byproduct of these rapid trends in which whites are shrinking as a part of the voting age population, as part of the overall population, and whether or not there's some causation there. So how do you guys spin this whole thing forward and think about, in an America that will look fundamentally different, just as a racial composition, fundamentally different 10 or 20 years from now, when our kids are sitting around having these complex conversations, how will this have evolved by then? Will we be in a better place where it is de-emphasized, de-escalated, deconstructed, destabilized? I'm sorry, so many Ds. Will it be destabilized, or do you think that this is actually going to get far more intense, for lack of a better way of putting it?
I mean, I think in the racial calculus is that the ideological use is protean. We'll figure out how to recoup race categories to justify other things, regardless of how the numbers go. That's the grim side or the dark side of things. I think the hopeful side, this is my attraction to Ibu's work, is that we need to figure out discourses and lean into concepts and language and practical forms of life with other people where there's skin in the game. We're committed to common causes, getting lead out of piping in homes, local forms of education and access. I think one of the problems within academia, as I alluded to earlier in terms of the kind of re-essentializing of white identity, is that one of the things I try to think about is how helpful is it to go around telling white people that the most important thing about them is that they're white? I mean, white nationalism seems to have done a good enough job on that score. And so I'd rather try to figure out ways to find coalitional possibilities that we share in common. I mean, I think part of the white nationalism kind of running rampant in this country is this kind of replacement narrative that, frankly, we feed into. Right? If we don't try to find coalitional possibilities. I mean, this is just Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, his masterpiece. At the end of the Civil War, what do you have in common in the plantation South? Really, really poor black folks and really, really poor white folks. And they began a coalitional set of possibilities around farming land because neither of them have access. But once that happens, once Jim Crow reinscribes white identity, right, then you're introduced into, what's introduced is what Du Bois called a psychological wage that paid off poor white people by telling them, well, at least you get to be white, right? That's the ideological ingredient. Rather, what we want to do, right, and there's a kind of inverted version of this now, where we don't think that white people, because they're white, morally matter. And maybe we decide as well that they don't politically matter. And so we don't invest in these realities. Well, if you're a white person in rural America and your kids also don't have access to education or equitable health care, right, and you turn on the news and the only thing you see when injustice is talked about is not white people and that you as a white person are to blame for this, right, we reinscribe a narrative, right, and it's like the inverted version of the psychological wage. We need to find better ways, and my guess is that local forms of community, many of which are religious, cross-racial, put us into practical projects with each other where the race stuff is deflated, its power is an explanatory category, and it forces us into kind of grounded life with one another, textured life with one another. That's what I want to hope, and I think that's what Ibu's been doing for a couple decades now.
Interfaith.org, and you can make a donation.
InterfaithAmerica.org.
Interfaithamerica.org.
Let me make two quick points. Thank you for that, Jonathan. All of it, both the analysis and the compliment. Two quick questions, 2 quick points. One is, 50, 60 years ago, was it Michael or David Novak who wrote the book, The Unmeltable Ethnics? Who? Michael Novak. So, anybody remember this book? This was how the Slavs, the Greeks, the Italians were never going to be white. This is written, 1950s, 1960s, 60 years after the term the melting pot was invented. Okay, the term melting pot was invented by Israel Zangwill in the early 1900s. 50 years later, this Catholic sociologist writes this book saying, hey, we've tried for 5 decades. It's not going to happen. You Greeks, you are people of color. You Slavs, you are people of color. You Italians, you are people of color. So here's my provocation. Are Latinos the next white ethnic group in America?
Or Asians, is what you're asking.
Both. And it's such an obvious question given American history that the stunning thing is that it's not the dominant discourse. That actually the dominant discourse is like how all of these quote-unquote non-white people are one single lumped category, which by the way, people of color, that's like 80% of the human race. It's just offensive to think we all have something in common such that you put us into the same category. But the other like obvious thing is the like warp and woof of American history is all of these groups, minus black people, basically become white ethnic groups. So why wouldn't that happen with Arab Americans, Asian Americans, and Latino Americans, right? Here's my second point. My kids, there are 20 best friends between the two of them. They're 12 and 15. There are 20 best friends. 15 of them are probably mixed race. Okay, that's probably on the high side, but my wild guess is if you canvass like if your kids are between the ages of call it 8 and 20, you canvass, depending on where you live, somewhere between a third, a quarter, and 2/3 are mixed race. Okay, so line those kids up, 1 to 20. 5 of them look black, although probably 3 of those 5 are mixed race, they still look black. 5 of them look pretty white. The other 10, you just can't tell. So the Palestinian Mexican kid does not look any different than the Greek kid. So what do you do with that? So my point is, we're living in a paradigm that does this thing right now of white people versus people of color. It's problematic for all of the smart reasons that Jonathan said. But in 20 years, in 10 years, we could be living in a very different paradigm. And in fact, David Hollinger wrote a very smart book 20 or 30 years ago called Post-Ethnic, where he basically said that the multiracial nature, the interracial nature of where many marriages are going, plus the positive economic and educational trajectory of black people will probably lead to a dramatic de-emphasis of race during in the next 50, 60, 70 years. That looked true during the Obama era, and then it didn't, right? So we could live in a very different kind of intellectual paradigm in 5 to 10 years. We should not assume that the way we think about the world now, the categories are going to remain.
Josh, can I just a really quick follow-up to Jonathan? So, Jonathan, you made the point at the end there. You said that that religion can play an essential role in trying to destabilize race as the explanatory construct. But parallel to this trend line of whites becoming a smaller and smaller piece of the population pie is America becoming more and more secular, and the rise of the nuns, the rise of people who are not part of any faith tradition at all. So how do you square that circle, right? I mean, not to try to make you not to try and darken your outlook even more, because I know that there's a bit of a yin and yang effect here with the two of you guys going back and forth, but I mean, really, in the absence of a more robust religious presence in American life, what else is there to try and de-emphasize some of this?
Yeah, I should say the spirit of all of your all's questions just reminds me journalists are a lot nicer than academics in terms of the kind of conversations. Yeah, I mean, and then there's also the part of the story of how religion actually just exacerbates everything, right? You can tell a story of an unholy trinity between American Christianity, American racism, and y'all white folks. So you also have that story. But say on the positive side, the kind of acid effects on congregational life, and this is multiple kinds of congregations, that's one of the deep problems. So what are the forms of associational possibilities where people gather around common projects, right? Whether it be civic life, like, different types of clubs or reading clubs or around certain activities, but certainly the kind that can offer what I describe as a kind of deep economy, a way of imagining our life with one another beyond the terms of competition, meritocracy, scarcity. I think that's what religion gives us. Your question is, as the rise of the nun and the loss of those communities, what happens? Maybe an optimistic move would be to say that maybe there's something metaphysically about humans that orients them to find that somehow in other kind of ways. The dark version of the story is that then we lose those alternative vocabularies and grammars. I think that's the force of the question that I heard earlier about the loss of associational civic life. So, and I don't know which way it'll go.
I wonder if we can grab a couple of paired questions. We're going to hard stop at 3:45 because we've got to keep our word, but maybe we've got, I've got Kelsey Dallas, Melanie Mason. Maybe you guys could combine and see how far that gets us, and then maybe we can get one more. Kelsey and Melanie, can you aim for 2 sentences or less if you can?
Jonathan, you said that there's a problem with seeing everything in deeply suspicious terms, but that's kind of what journalists are all about quite often. So I just wonder if you have words of wisdom for the journalism field as we sort of navigate this tricky topic.
And Melanie, please, too.
Well, Ibu, I can talk to you sort of offline about the specific Georgetown reference that you made, because I have a lot of interest in that. So I think Kelsey's excellent question can be the...
Perfect. Let's make sure we get to Kelsey and Robert down and get yours in, if you can.
Along that line, I guess, one of the things I've been thinking about, I'm sorry if it doesn't seem like a fully formed thought, I'm trying to do it in 2 sentences and I'm already at 3, so.
No, you got it. Grace.
My editors love me. I guess within the context of the space in which I work mostly is in white evangelicalism, and specifically on an issue that is both systemic but individual, especially in a congregational denomination like the SBC. And I guess, if you look at all that polling on white evangelicals on concepts of individual sin, Jonathan touched on this very early earlier, on individual sin, on what is the root cause of things. They see themselves often as not part of the system, so therefore everything is an individual failing. I mean, it's the same type of rhetoric and belief that applies to racism, to child abuse, to what have you. And I guess I'm just wondering, as two people who think often about, concept of talking about how we talk about stuff, I guess what have you guys found helpful to try and pierce that veil, or is it impenetrable?
Mm-hmm. And let's get Hal Boyd as well, and then you guys have one closing comment, okay? Hal. And Jack, if we can, why not?
This is going to be interesting.
Load the mind, please.
A good intellectual exercise to combine all these questions. So I've just, generally the Gallup trends have us at the lowest race relation rating that we've had in I think since 2000. What do you attribute that to? And the drop off seems to be around 2013, somewhere around there, and then just starts to precipitate. Now we're at the nadir of that. That's my question.
Good.
And then just real briefly, just bouncing off something both of you said, I'm curious about your thoughts about what happens when you were talking about religion as this vehicle to kind of unsettle a lot of these trends. What happens when they theoretically could do the opposite? So I'm just using this as an example. The Hispanic evangelicals in particular, as individual faith communities are one thing, but are definitely targeted by the Republican Party right now as a place to expand their influence, and then some of the figures within those spaces, that overlaps with whiteness and what have you. And so what happens when those religious identities also complicate political identities, which also complicate how you talk about racial identities, when they don't work in the direction that you were talking about earlier.
Thank you guys for such easy questions. All right, 2 or 3 minutes of closing comment, like TV, and then we're done. Who's up?
I'm quite optimistic about journalism. When I was doing research for the book, I actually found my most hopeful story was written by journalists who were seeking out places in the world they thought, hey, this is actually a place of hope, and I want to tell this story. So interestingly, the book's got 2 big sets of pushback. One is whether my account of racial capitalism is sufficient to capture racism. Perfectly good question. And the second one is, how dare you offer a constructive proposal? And I'm not sure what to do with that sense of things. But I look to a lot of journalists, or journalism in general, to tell really powerful stories. I mean, there's so many good questions. I just want to say, the individual corporate thing, I mean, at least I lived on campus for 10 years with the undergrads, and the best way I got them to do this is to help them tell stories where both were deeply entwined with one another. And I think, at least in Judaism and Christianity, that's always the case. That the story, and if it redounds to a sense of individual responsibility and calling, all the better. So I definitely want the two to go together, but I definitely feel you that there is a sense that, well, that's not me, and I don't speak for the system, this kind of thing. So
to make a comment on the white evangelical question for a second, and as far as the kind of individual and corporate stuff, I know that less. But because white evangelicals are kind of constructed as the big bad guy in my world, I'm just wired to be like, I wonder how this might not be the case, right? So I'm just paying attention to those stories. And here's the one that I found most striking. This was, I don't know, I think this was around 2016. Trump is running for office, and there's just this virulent anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiment, right? And all the poll numbers show it's strongly supported by Southern white evangelicals, blah, 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 all this stuff, right? And then there's this piece in the New York Times of this white evangelical, might have been a Southern Baptist church in Mississippi, where the congregants are the people taking the recent Sudanese refugees, Muslim or Christian, and showing them around Walmart, right? And I love that story, right? And not just because it played against type, but because it wasn't because it was an alternative logic, and I'm really interested in what that logic is. So my wild guess is a majority of those people voted against the refugee policy. If the refugee policy was put to a vote, right, particularly if it was charged with Donald Trump type language, they would have voted against it. But when the Sudanese Muslims, different race, different religion, are in the community, they're the actual ones taking them to Walmart. I'm actually super interested in that. And the way that I think is it's the exact opposite way as academics think, right? Which is find something concretely good in the world and ask how to do it more. And almost quite frequently, that concrete thing good in the world is taking place within some kind of religious context, and I'm interested in that, right? Like, how do we do more of this? And if these people won't vote for refugee policies if you put it like this, but will help refugees concretely if the story is told like this, then just tell the story like this. And is there a way to then tell the story to get different groups of people who want to help refugees more? And I actually think of that as, people are like, but that's not systemic change. First of all, I'm like, what the hell is systemic change, right? Like you say it like it's an incantation. Like if you chant in systemic change 100 times, the system will change, right? Systemic change is like lots of things happening like this. Lots of things happening like this, and then maybe a national, like a larger discourse emerging around it, and then maybe it changing a national story, and then maybe it impacting things like policy and law. So it's a different way of thinking about change. And what I want to end with is I actually think it's a religious way of thinking about change, and it comes from Islam, for me from Islam, and it actually is a very different understanding of the term prophet or prophetic, right? So often when Christians and Jews, and I say this with great respect, use the term prophetic and prophetic voice, they mean somebody who stands up and makes a big speech against the social order. That is not principally how Muslims who orient around the example of the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings be of God, principally understand it. Why is that? Because the Prophet Muhammad isn't just somebody who gives a Jeremiah against a current order. Yes, that is what he does, right? And it's collected in part in the form of the Quran. He's somebody who builds an alternative social order. He's basically Peter, Paul, and Jesus in one, right? And so that's my model for change. And to be very concrete about this, when the prophet moves from Mecca where he preaches for 12, 13 years and then is hounded out because of his Jeremiads against the social order, its economy, its exploitation, all of this, right? He's hounded out on pain of death, and he moves to a city called Yathrib. It gets renamed Medina, the city of the prophet. And the prophet does three things when he first arrives. He creates a constitution, right? A kind of document institution, called the Constitution of Medina, which is a loyalty pact which recognizes the distinctiveness of a variety of the communities and sects and tribes, their ethnic and their religious distinctiveness, Jews, Christians, pagans, etc., recognizes all of them and says, we will work together at times of mutual defense. The second thing he does is he builds a masjid, which, by the way, is not just a mosque for Muslim worship, it is a community center for gathering. So when Christians come to Medina to do things like argue doctrine with the prophet, when they need to pray, they pray in his mosque, right? So he builds a community center, an institution. And the third thing he does is he builds a market. He builds a place where people can exchange. And so that's like my model of social change. My model of social change is the articulation of a better vision in which a critique of the existing order is implicit, but it's not the most important thing, right? It's an articulation of a better vision, and then it's institutions that instantiate it.
Lovely. So if that mini sermon whet your appetite just a little bit, you should know that the last chapter of Ibu's excellent book is actually a letter to his two sons with some of these same themes in mind. And it's lovely, and I encourage you to take a copy of the book and to read it well. We got one last word from Jonathan, because maybe it was like, you heard a little bit of a sermon. Here you got to say a sermon too, who knows? And then I got one thing to say about our free time, okay?
Ibu just converted me.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the political key of anti-racism needs to be proclamation, not resistance. Not that resistance isn't part of the language you use, but what are we calling people to? What are we inviting people to? And I love the Medina city on the hill image in Ibu's work. One of my favorite stories in the research, so I talk about this church in San Francisco, but one of the characters in the story is a woman who is at Stanford University. And she talked about Stanford being a place where you simultaneously learn two things. One, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. And two, you're at Stanford to save the world. That's why you're at Stanford, right? That's why you're a Rhodes Scholar. And the world's terrible, you're going to fix it. And she talked about how at Stanford, learning those two things simultaneously led to what she described as a paralytic episode. She literally couldn't put one foot in front of the other. She was so overwhelmed by the pressure of this calling. And so she ended up finding her way to this church redeemer. And what she described there was finding people who were fed and nourished by the Christian liturgy, where the primary message of the liturgy is this world's got trouble, but this world is a beautiful place and God is committed to it. Where the radicalness was just in the ordinary practice of loving neighbors and gathering in worship and thinking through a local community. And there she realized that the radicalness of this world was simply leaning into what she thought God was already doing, not what she had to conjure up on her own, that the primary key was going to be something like proclamation. And what you're saying just now just reminded me of how powerful of a story this is, that what we need is prophetic in the full sense of the idea.
I think the best faith angle speakers have a little faith in the mix, and I'm grateful to you both so much for the thick presentation and work. Thank you, guys.